Peace I leave with you. My peace I give you. I give to you not as the world gives. Don't be troubled or afraid.
The teachings of Jesus and the central Jewish hope of shalom is peace. Peace is the expressed heart of the three great Abrahamic faiths of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And in his greatest sermon, Jesus preached these famous words.
Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God.
Last weekend, my family made a trip to the World War I Museum. And the weekend before that, a group of people from Colonial, we went to a movie. We had a movie night out, and we went to the Tolkien movie, which tells the story of John Tolkien's childhood friends and how they grew together, how they grew up, and how the lives of all of them were either ended or deeply wounded in the Great War. And the museum, if you've been to the museum, do you know that glass bridge over the field of poppies? When you walk in, there is a field of poppies, and each poppy, there are 9,000 of these, and every flower stands for 1,000 lives lost. And on that glass bridge, there was an Army veteran of the Vietnam War. And he had a table, he was a docent, and he was out and he was demonstrating all of these gadgets and devices from the First World War. And as he was doing this, he made this comment, and this comment just stuck with me. He said, every one of the nations of Europe believed that God was on their side. And I've thought about this a lot. Either God is completely messed up or just doesn't care. And I've come to believe it's the latter. And his words really struck me. I didn't say anything. Standing on that bridge over the symbol of 9 million people killed, I didn't say anything. Part of me wanted to say something to kind of, defend God. But the truth is that a lot of war has been waged in God's name or claiming God's support.
When you march out to battle your enemies, and you see horses, chariots, and a fighting force larger than yours, don't be afraid of them, because the Lord, your God, the one who brought you up from Egypt, is with you. As you advance toward the war, the priest will come forward and will address the troops. He will say to them, "Listen, Israel, right now you are advancing to wage war against your enemies. Don't be discouraged. Don't be afraid. Don't panic. Don't shake in fear on account of them, because the Lord your God is going with you to fight your enemies for you and to save you."
It's Memorial Day weekend, and it's a time to remember those who have died in war. It's a time to acknowledge in spirit and in truth that we who come together in the name of God, we and our ancestors over the millennia, we have struggled with the concept and the consequences of war. We have claimed that God is on our side. When John Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings, it was in the years immediately after the Second World War, in which he served in the British government as a code breaker. He was a great linguist. And he himself was a combat veteran of the First World War, and he knew firsthand the cost and the consequences of war. And in his epic Lord of the Rings, he told the story of the nation of Rohan, which was largely an agrarian country, a country of horses and just a little industry. The nation of Rohan, though, was somewhat removed from the conflict between Gondor and Mordor. Rohan was America. Like the United States, the decision for Rohan to go to war was not a given. Now, in this world, there once was a young man named Langdon Gilkey, and he grew up in Illinois. And actually, I learned a little thing about Langdon Gilkey. He was born in 1935, and he and Art Foster taught together at the University of Chicago at one point. Well, back in 1939, Gilkey was 20 years old. He was a student studying at Harvard, and he was studying philosophy, and he was playing on the Harvard tennis team. And philosophically, Gilkey, he had it all figured out. He was against the very concept of war. Now, he wasn't particularly religious, but the idea of war was detestable to him. In Tolkien's epic, Rohan knew enough about war to know that they were not prepared. They were also buffered from the conflict by their geography. The war was not at their doorstep. So it is not a given that the people of Rohan would join the war, even against an evil enemy. Langdon Gilkey just happened to be in France in September 1939. He was on a tour with the Harvard-Yale tennis team, and he had no love for Hitler. And he certainly saw the fear in France as Germany began to invade all over Europe. In the middle of all of that, he and the Harvard-Yale tennis team were whisked quickly to safety across the sea back to these United States. Gilkey was 20 years old, and philosophically, he had it all figured out. War was wrong, even against an evil enemy. In a matter of months, Hitler's forces occupied almost all of Europe. The report of the concentration camps began to arrive. The genocide of Jews was underway. Gilkey's certainty of conviction was beginning to show cracks. And a few months after being whisked to safety and out of harm's way in France, he went to hear the Christian theologian Reinhold Niebuhr speak at the Harvard Chapel. Now, Reinhold Niebuhr he studied at my alma mater, my seminary, Eden Theological Seminary in St. Louis, which a child of this congregation, David Greenhaw, is currently the president of that seminary. And Niebuhr was one of the great theologians of the 20th century. And on that day in the spring of 1940, Langdon Gilkey was, to use his own words, converted. Niebuhr said in that worship service at Harvard Chapel, if we were loyal to peace and refused intervention into the Second World War, then we would inevitably be disloyal to justice and hence aid in the establishment of a radically unjust and oppressive world. And that even that war, though war is sin, he never said otherwise. It is sin brought about by humanity's brokenness and the desire for worldly power. That the decision to engage in war sometimes must be made in the name of justice. Because without justice, there can be no peace, no true peace. True peace is more than just the absence of violent conflict. And standing by sometimes aids in the establishment of oppression. Niebuhr's Christianity held that there were times that when love of neighbor meant engaging against systems of oppression and hatred. there are times that we must answer the call.
The beacons have been city! The beacons are lit! Gun knuckles for 8!
And Rohan will answer. Muster the Rohirrim.
Niebuhr's words lit something inside of Langdon Gilkey that day. Gilkey answered. He began down a new path, and although he hated violence, he felt that he was called and convicted to resist the powers of evil and oppression. And so within 3 months of hearing Niebuhr, Gilkey was on his way on a ship to China to aid the resistance to the Japanese invasion. He did this a full year before the United States entered the war. Langdon Gilkey was captured and held for 4 years in a Japanese internment camp. So this month, my oldest son, Paul, turned 18. And on day after that, or Monday after that, we went to register him for selected service. The very concept of losing a child to war or otherwise is very sobering. Not just my son, but any child of God. And so standing on a glass bridge over poppies, representing the deaths of 9 million of God's children, should cause anyone to pause. And on this Memorial Day, I wonder, who has the moral right, the moral authority to make the decision to go to war? Is it the leaders of the land? And would they be willing to put their own children in harm's way? Is it the moms? You know, the original idea behind Mother's Day that we celebrated a few weeks ago, the original idea of Mother's Day was that if mothers were the ones to make the decisions to go to war, we might have a lot less war. I deeply believe that we all owe service and duty to our nation and to the world. And if service, military or otherwise, was a requirement for everyone, how might that change our decisions to go to war? As it is, these moral questions are not an abstraction. In every generation, our world faces new evils. And evil will attempt, as always, to deceive, to convince us that war is right and sometimes even righteous. And each of us has the responsibility to soberly discern God's will, knowing that there are no easy answers. Langdon Gilkey was released from the Japanese internment camp after the war in September of 1945. He came back to the United States and he became a teaching assistant to Reinhold Niebuhr. Both men remained convinced and convicted of the United States' decision to enter into the Second World War. But both men would then go on to oppose the United States' decision to fight in Vietnam. In every generation, we face the moral question of war. We do even at this moment. Though sometimes the news cycle is such that we are tempted to dismiss it. But this is Memorial Day weekend. It's a time to honor those who have died in war, to remember the decisions of the past, and to consider soberly the cost and consequence of war then and now. That is our torch to hold. Please now, if you are able, please rise now to honor the words of Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae, which are being read by Leonard Cohen. Please rise if you're able.
In Flanders fields, the poppies blow. Between the crosses, row on row that mark our place. And in the sky, the larks, still bravely singing, fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved. And now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands, we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields.
In the days after the war, the poppy, it was the first plant to return to the blood-soaked fields of Europe. It became a symbol of resurrection and responsibility, to take up the quarrel, the deep moral questions of war. Let's now join our voices together with the hymn Faith of the Martyrs, which is number 381 in our hymnal or on screen.